Welcome you as well. My name is Annie Green, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session. So, welcome to the International Institute for Knowledge and Innovation series called The Blind-Sighted Enterprise. A lot may question why the blind-sighted enterprise is actually leading the blind-sighted enterprise because we know so much, but then there's so much that might not be visible to us. So, these series of presentations are to help to uncover some of those things that are not visible to us that we just don't see currently out in our environment and out in the enterprises that we run. Our last session was focused on barriers to change, and that was given by Dr. Steve Hoffman and Dr. Victoria Grady, which went extremely well, and we had quite a bit of conversation. The focus on today's session is called Shifting Consciousness, and we will have our speakers, Dr. William Bill Halal, presenting on his topic called the Democratic Enterprise, and then followed by Dr. John Lewis presenting on his topic of story thinking. So sit back and let's get ready because we're going to be once again entertained through some thought-provoking presentations, and then afterwards we're going to have hopefully a very engaging discussion again. So let me introduce our first speaker. William E. Halal is a professor emeritus of management, technology, and innovation at George Washington University with degrees from Purdue and UC Berkeley. He has published 7 books and hundreds of articles, consults to corporations and governments, and is a frequent speaker, once substituting for Peter Drucker. Halal is founder of the TechCast project and also a co-founder, also the co-founder of this Institute of Knowledge and Innovation that is actually housing these series of presentations. Previously, he served as a major in the Air Force, an aerospace engineer on the Apollo program, and a manager in Silicon Valley. He received the 1977 Mitchell Prize, $10,000, for his article Beyond the Profit Motive. And his article Through the Mega Crisis was awarded Outstanding Paper of 2013 by Emerald Publishing. Halal was cited by the Encyclopedia of Future as one of the top 100 futurists in the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill. Bill, it's yours. Oh, before you say that, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. And again, Bill will be taking some questions while he's giving his presentation.
I'd like to keep a dialogue going here as we go along. I suppose you know, this is a program run by the Institute to rejuvenate our work with our audience. We want to get involved with you people. We want to hear what you need, what topics you want to discuss, what your interests are. So please let us know more afterwards. Now, my talk, I'm going to switch to my presentation now. A second. Okay. There are 2 topics really in my talk. The first one, I'm going to talk about what I call the democratic enterprise. As you probably know, the Business Roundtable 2 years ago announced the end of shareholder primacy. That is, corporations were no longer to focus on profit alone, but they were now intended to serve the needs of all stakeholders, which I think is historic. As soon as that was announced, I could tell this was going to change everything, and it has. 90% of corporations now practice ESG, environment, social, and governance. That's a response to the Business Roundtable decision. I'm going to tell you about my work in this area. For many years, this has been a focus of mine. The Mitchell Prize I won 40 years ago laid out a different way of thinking about the corporation as a socio-economic system. And that's very revealing, I think. It gives us the groundwork for understanding why the corporation should become democratic. But that was 40 years ago, and now it's here. As I said, almost all corporations are are doing something in that direction, ESG. And I want to call your attention to this Fortune article I published a few months ago. The democratic enterprise will redefine our society. I don't think they would have published this 2 or 3 years ago. The fact that they accepted this tells me that it's here now. They understand that this is where it's going. So this is a very exciting thing. I think it's going to redefine business in a very powerful way. And then I want to put this in context by relating it to the message in my book. You can see the cover of the book here, Beyond Knowledge, to show that this is not simply altruism. Corporations are taking this on out of necessity because they see these enormous problems ahead that they have to address, or they're not going to survive, like climate change and other threats. So this is being done out of necessity, and it puts business in the lead. They really could lead us, I think, out of this global mess that we're in, what I call a crisis of global maturity. The world is facing these enormous threats that have just created enormous doubt and doom and gloom. And I think if business really does what they could do here with the concept of democratic enterprise, they could lead the world out of that. So let me move on now, and please offer your comments and questions as we go along. Here, I want to just start by describing, oops, sorry, just go over the history of the role of the corporation. The profit center model, of course, is what we were most familiar with. And that made sense during the industrial age because capital was the major need for building factories and that kind of thing. But then the social responsibility model came out 50 years ago. Really, it started at my alma mater, UC Berkeley, 50 years ago. And it was a nice response, but it was seen as philanthropic. It was something that we were telling corporations to be responsible, but who wants to take on more responsibility? So it really didn't have terribly much effect. And it really created tension with the profit-centered model because they seemed opposed to one another. What's happening, I think, is the move to what I call a collaborative enterprise model here on the right. And this sees the corporation as a collection of resources. These different stakeholders are resources. They all have something the corporation needs to survive. And the arrows run in both directions, which indicates that now this is seen as a partnership between management and the various stakeholders. And the intent is to integrate all of these resources into a more productive whole so that everybody benefits, including making more money for investors with less risk and less government intrusion. That's what I'm going to show you. Any comments about this, or should I move on? Okay. Now, this is the socioeconomic model that won me the Mitchell Prize. And what I did basically is I took the model that has always been used for shareholders, for investors, and I just used that model for all of the other stakeholders. And the investor model is very simple, of course. Investors invest equity and debt capital. They receive these benefits, dividends, and capital gains, and they suffer losses. So I just took that and applied it to all of the other stakeholders. And I found that, yes, there is something in each of these cells. Each of the stakeholders invests resources, they receive benefits, and they incur costs. So there's really no difference, I don't think, between the role of investors vis-a-vis other shareholders, other stakeholders. Any comments or questions about this? Okay. Now here, this was an attempt to provide some numbers to just test out this model and see if we could, if it made some sense, if we could just estimate roughly what could fill in each of these cells. We ran a simulation a few hundred times. This is the result. I don't want to get into the details of the numbers because they're not really important. But the main thing is that this seems to be a realistic model of the corporation, describing the role of all of the stakeholders. Any comments? Okay. Now, here's what I think we can learn from all this. First of all, there's no essential difference between the role of investors and stakeholders. As I said, they all invest resources, incur costs, and expect to receive benefits. So the choice of focusing on optimizing profit for shareholders or serving employees or customers is really arbitrary. It's just a political choice. You can find corporations that are run by workers where they focus on the role of labor. You can find consumer cooperatives where they focus on consumers. So it's really arbitrary. And by focusing on profit, we do serious sub-optimization of the system. The total sum of all of the social benefits and costs are an order of magnitude greater than the financial numbers. So there's serious problem of sub-optimization taking place here. And then on the third bullet, to do this effectively, you need to have some measures of social impact for the other stakeholders. And that's easily done. 20 or 30 years ago, there was a big push to do this by developing what was called social accounting. So there's lots of practices that can be done to easily get the social measures you need so you can manage the relationship between the various stakeholders. And then the main point here, bullet number 4, is that in principle, if this were done well, if management were able to work with all of the stakeholders to solve strategic problems, this could become a competitive advantage. It could serve everybody's needs far better. And then the next bullet, one of the benefits of this is that since the stakeholders are now incorporated in the management of the firm, there's the sources of risk and uncertainty are incorporated into the firm, and so they're under control now. So there should be less turbulence, less risk.
Hey, Bill, we have a question
Sure.
before we move up to the other one. Could you please provide some examples of social measures?
Yeah, well, you'd measure for workers the pay and benefits vis-a-vis other companies. It would be social satisfaction, job satisfaction, things like that. For customers, it would be what's called consumer surplus, which is, it's a little hard to explain, but it's the residual benefits that they get beyond the money they pay for the products and so forth. I hope is that a good enough example to get into? You want more? I hope that does it. But I want to go back and emphasize this point about self-regulating. The firm can become a self-regulating system since it deals directly with all of the social impacts that it creates. So there would be less role for government and less risk for the corporation as a whole. So that is, I think, a powerful advantage. And finally, I think this puts managers in a role that they can more easily defend. The old model in which managers were focused primarily on making money put them in a terrible position. And that's where where business got the reputation of being greedy and all of that sort of thing, because of the focus on profit alone. But that's how do you defend the fact that you're going to relegate the interests of workers and customers to a secondary status. It's very hard to defend a role like that. But this role is a very honorable role. Managers become servant leaders. They are their job is to serve the interests of all of the stakeholders as best as they can by unifying their efforts into a more productive whole. Any other comments or questions about this? This is, I think, the essence of what I want to show you. These are really important points. Any comments, questions? Okay, now, here is a great example of a company that did this, and it nicely illustrates the benefits. Bonneville Power is a utility in the northwest of the country, and they had a lot of trouble with labor unions and governments who were giving them what they saw as a lot of trouble. And they made a point of starting to talk to all of these constituencies. And here's what they learned. This is really quite amazing. Our adversaries helped us find creative solutions to intractable problems. Public involvement is a must for today's managers. Conflict is unavoidable. The only choice is whether to dodge it or harness it. That is exactly right. This is an opportunity for managers to take all that conflict and turn it into something productive. Any comments about that? Now, here are examples of companies that have done this for decades, really, all over the world. And it highlights the fact that this really is practice now, but it's relegated to the margins because it's not in keeping with the prevailing business culture, which focuses on money. So this has been around for decades, and we have some good experiences in how to do this. So the only challenge really is to bring it into the mainstream. We know how to do this. We just have to make it into the mainstream. Any comments or questions about this? Okay, now I'm going to move to the second half of my presentation, which is a little more complex, a little more demanding, but very important, because I want to put this in context. I want to show what it means for the world as a whole. And I think what it means is that business is called upon to contribute to the great challenge facing the world now, which is to create a model of global consciousness to deal with these enormous threats that block progress: climate change, inequality, pandemics, economic depressions. The list goes on. There are dozens of threats out there that tell us that the world is not going to survive unless something serious is done to solve these problems. And now here, this graph, I'm very proud of this. I'm trying to move some of these things out of the way so you can see what's going on. I did this many years ago, and I think it's a breakthrough in our understanding of social evolution. The graph, because it provides real data and real scales to map the rise of civilization very precisely, all the way from the very beginning to where we are now. And it's all empirical data, historic data. So it's a scientific model, really. And what really amazed me when I first did this is to see that the data points all fit an S-curve precisely. When you normally plot data, there's usually scatter. There's no scatter here. All of these data points fit the S-curve precisely, which this is very convincing to me. It gives you confidence in the fact that this S-curve, this great S-curve, is very meaningful. S-curves, as you probably know, are characteristic of all life forms. A culture of bacteria will grow in accordance with an S-curve. The growth of a human being follows an S-curve. This is the S curve mapping the life of civilization on this planet. And I want to just go through one or two of the major points here because I think they're important. For instance, the knowledge age was introduced, as I see it, the year 2000. And I remember in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when I was a young professor, and I could see this coming, and I would tell people that we're likely to see personal computers. That was when computers filled rooms, you know. And the response I got usually was, why would anybody want a personal computer? And that highlights how difficult it is to imagine a new stage of social evolution. It was so hard to anticipate an age of consciousness. An age of knowledge. It was just impossible. People couldn't figure it out. But here we are now. It happened right on time, the year 2000. That's when IKI started. Mike Stankowski and I started just about the year 2000 because corporations were all calling themselves knowledge organizations. Most people were doing knowledge work, and everybody was starting to buy PCs and laptops. And so I was right about that. I anticipated that by 20 years or more. And something similar is happening now at the year 2020. I take the year 2020 as the beginning of the age of consciousness. Let me explain why. First of all, it's indicated by the model, because the time period from the beginning of industrialization to the service age was roughly 100 years. And then the period from the service age to the knowledge age was 50 years. So that tells you what the progression of time frames looks like. And if you take that same progression, then you would expect something like 20 or 30 years for the next stage of evolution. And that's exactly what I think is happening. From the year 2000 to the year 2020. And by definition, everything beyond knowledge is consciousness. And I'll make that more clear later. So I think this makes perfect sense. But why the year 2020? Well, something very specific happened in the year 2020 that I think marks that point where we really started entering the age of consciousness. And what do you think it was? Let's think about that. What happened in 2020 that was striking, that illustrated the power of subjective thought, of consciousness? Any ideas? I think it was the insurrection on the Capitol. That was just a glaring example where beliefs trumped data, facts. And that's where we are now. We're in an age of post-factual understanding where people can believe whatever they want, unrelated to facts. So that's consciousness, but it's a crazy kind of consciousness, of course. Normally you think of consciousness as enlightenment. Well, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than that. Consciousness includes everything, the good stuff and the bad stuff. And right now we're in a bad state of consciousness. We have all of this madness going around in the world, but it's consciousness. And I'll make that more clear later. So we've entered an age of consciousness now. It's just the very beginning of it. And I think this is going to be propelled seriously by what I call a mental spiritual revolution. All of these stages of evolution have been driven by revolutions in thought. The agrarian revolution, the industrial revolution, the post-industrial revolution, the information revolution. And so I think we're likely to see a revolution in thought. And my TechCast project estimates that at 2030 plus or minus 5 years. And I think that's a good forecast. I think that's going to hold up. Now this is complicated, so I'm sure you have some questions about this. What are your thoughts? Everybody accepts this without questions? I don't believe that.
Well, John Hubble did put a message into the chat. That said, I'm trying to would be fun to overlay this with ego development, adult development theories. Dr. Suzanne Cook, Gruder, Bill Torbert, Jennifer Garvey, and Berger, etc. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. Yeah, that's what this is. It's human development on a global scale. I think that's exactly right. You could compare it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's remarkable that this is happening in our lifetimes. We are privileged, I think, to be around when civilization is reaching what is really, I think, the culmination of our development, an age of consciousness. That implies maturity, like an adult. And it implies that we are going to address these big challenges and we're going to develop the awareness to do it the way a young person goes through their whole stage of development to reach maturity, where they go through their own crisis of maturity. Any other questions or comments about this? I think this is really important. I don't think you can understand what's happening today unless you see it in terms of social evolution.
Okay, we do have a couple other questions. Um, does this align with Larry Pruzak's ideas around the need for more wisdom on top of knowledge?
Yeah, you could think of consciousness as wisdom. Exactly, exactly.
Okay, and we have what characteristics do we look for in assessing the mental spiritual revolution that you and others are forecasting?
Well, this is going to be tough because, we had all that trouble understanding the knowledge age 20 years ago. Uh, before it started, it seemed, so abstract and remote. Uh, so I'm not sure we know exactly, but I think a good example is what happened in the midterm elections in the U.S. It's amazing. Uh, we I we were trying to forecast that at TechCast. I thought it would happen about 2050 after the presidential elections, but it happened in the midterm election, and it's so striking. The the crisis in this country on democracy has been resolved by the midterm elections. It's brought clarity. The country's gone from feeling despondent about the future, feeling terrified about the possible loss of democracy, to feeling optimistic again. There's a break in the crisis. I think it was crisis break. And so it'll be something similar to that, I would think, only on a global scale.
Hey,
Annie?
Bill, I'm gonna do two more questions so that we can move along with the presentation. But the next one is how much is individual consciousness and how much is collective consciousness?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. We have to reach a certain critical mass of people who have collective consciousness in order to precipitate a global consciousness.
Okay,
That's a very good point. I think that's true. And
great.
I,
I, yeah, I think I must save the other one till when we get to the discussion period because we have a comment on it that I think is really good as well. So
good. Okay,
let's,
let's go.
yeah,
Okay.
okay.
Okay, now here, this explains what's going on in terms of the process. The triangle here maps the structure of consciousness, and it specifies two different types of consciousness, objective and subjective, which is well recognized in the scientific world. In fact, it comes from Descartes. The objective stuff is what computers are good at, data, knowledge, and making decisions. And one way to see what's happening is that the digital revolution is automating the objective stuff, which drives attention up the hierarchy of consciousness into the subjective realm. And that's what we're seeing now. The focus on emotions, values, beliefs, purpose, choices, all of that subjective stuff. That's very different than objective knowledge. This is what scientists call qualia. It differs from individual to individual. It's not objective. And that's where we are now. This is where the creativity of humanity comes in. And so I think this explains very nicely uh, uh, the dynamics that are taking place now. The digital revolution is automating all of the objective functions, driving attention into the subjective realm of higher consciousness. Any questions about this? Okay. Now, here's what I call the crisis of global maturity. Marion and I did a study a couple of years ago. We found that roughly 60 to 70% probability of disaster from all of these things we worry about, climate, pandemics, and so forth. The pandemic left people with the feeling that the system doesn't work, or at least parts of the system. This is amazing. New York Times reported on a survey of 10,000 people that it concluded 56% think humanity is doomed. Isn't that amazing? That more than half of the people in the world, I think, probably feel this way. They see all this horrible stuff going on. They don't see how we're going to get through it. And the UN report on climate change recently said that we can expect a total societal collapse unless something is done very quickly. Now, here's the solution. Here's the TechCast forecast on global consciousness. We estimate a 55% probability that this will happen in 2030, plus or minus 5 years. Now, 55% probability reflects the fact that there's great uncertainty about this. There's doubt. People have great fears. So it's not entirely certain. Any comments or questions? Okay. Here's where I consider this the bottom line. Institutions. We have to resolve, transform all of these institutions to make this work, because institutions are the organs of society. And for the business corporation, our estimate for democratic enterprise is that a 70% probability of it happening this decade. That's a pretty strong forecast, but I think it makes sense. This is moving along very quickly. I noticed the corporations who practice ESG are determined to do it. They get a lot of flack. People call it greenwashing, but they call it woke capitalism. But they seem to defend what they're doing. They seem to be committed to doing it because they know they don't have a choice. I think that really sums up, that's the end of my presentation. Yes, okay, that's it. So let me turn this over to John.
Um, Hi. Thanks, Bill, for such a great presentation. Um, I do have one poll for Bill that we'd like to take. Uh, I'm going to bring this one up in a minute. And you should see this now. Does the concept of collaborative/democratic enterprise make sense to you? Um,
What are the two sets of numbers, Abby?
hmm?
Well, there are two sets of numbers, 7707. What does that mean?
Yeah, there's yes or no. I'm just giving them time so they can do, and then we'll show it.
Okay.
It looks good right now. Okay, I'm about to end the poll. And let's see what the results are. So out of the 9 that answered, 100% say that they get the concept.
That is amazing. That's astonishing. Usually there's a third of the audience has serious doubts. This is quite amazing. It speaks for the quality of the participants here, I think.
Mhm. Okay, so let's move along now. If you could stop sharing
Okay.
at this time. And what I'd like to do is introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. John Lewis. Dr. John Lewis is a consultant, keynote speaker, and a coach on the topics of knowledge, innovation, and change. He has authored the books The Explanation Age and Story Thinking, Transforming Organizations for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which provide tools for the coming age of rapid change and decision transparency. John is the co-creator of the Cohero Institute Advanced Profile for Collaborative Change Leadership, which uses the story cycle as the principal model of change. He is on the advisory board with the Lifeboat Foundation, a senior research associate with the International Institute of Knowledge and Innovation, and an associate editor for leadership and organizational behavior with the Journal of Innovation Management. With Big Five consulting experience, John holds a doctoral degree in educational psychology from the University of Southern California with a dissertation focus on mental model. Okay, so let's move on to the second one. John, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Annie. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
All right, story thinking, how to leverage story as the operational enterprise model. And I do think this is going to dovetail nicely with Bill's presentation. Before we jump in, I have a quick question up front for you. When navigating somewhere new, which would you rather have? If you only could have one or the other, let's say it's 500 miles away, a long drive, you haven't ever been there before, and you could be given directions or a map, and maybe pop up the poll. Let's see what they choose here. Okay.
Very nice, John.
Wow. There's a reason it's called a treasure map, I suppose. So most of you, okay, thanks for that. So most of you are choosing a map. Usually when I ask this question live and ask people why they chose that, the kinds of things we hear is, wow, I wish I had known that that there was a place along the way that I would have stopped if I'd known it was just a mile out of the way. That'd be a great thing to do. Or the other big item that comes up is, what if there's a detour? There's an accident or something happens and I'm sent around somewhere I just have no idea at that point, no orientation to where I'm at to base my directions on. So that's generally the answers that we get there. So let's go ahead and bring this down. Okay. So here's a quick quote just to kick us off. We think in story. It's hardwired in our brain. It's how we make strategic sense of the otherwise overwhelming world around us, in a book called Wired for Story. So I have this question. Is the sense-making pattern of stories just for how we should talk, or also for how we should think and learn and work? We always say storytelling, like that's the core term, rather than story. But storytelling uses story as a communication strategy, and nothing against that. It's very powerful. I think we can go even further and look at how to use story as an operational strategy. It's great to learn how to tell a great story. It's even greater to learn how to live a better story. And in fact, great psychologist Carl Jung says, you're in a story, whether you know it or not. Just to kind of get your head around this, sometime next year, you could probably tell a story about this year, some missed opportunities, some development, some things that went right and wrong, and projects completed, and put that in a story. If that's true, that means this year, guess what? You are in a story. And how powerful would it be this year if you knew that, and some ways to move through that in a better way? So that's what we're going to look at. Let's start with this classic pattern, the hero's journey, popularized by Joseph Campbell. And George Lucas said he used this to base his Star Wars saga on. Starts it with this idea of status quo, just minding my own business, nothing changing, and then something happens, a call to an adventure. And then the hero's journey ends up with looking into what it would take and saying, you got the wrong person, refusal of the call. Finally running into someone that's going to help you and some assistance, and at some point crossing the threshold, saying, okay, I'm going to have to go after this There'll be trials. You'll know when you're approaching the thing he calls the ordeal. And then when you beat that big ordeal, there's some initial reward, but it's not over. You did something, but you haven't necessarily immediately become something else. So there's a road back, a new life, and steps that have to happen before we return transformed as sort of a new creature at that point. The generic story, if you study film, is very similar. Starts with what they call the exposition. All movies start with sort of understanding what was happening before something started. And then some desperation, which could just be out of boredom. It could be something bad happens, or even something good. Desperation of today only half price. Marketing has learned this cycle very well. Moving through revelation, you look into it, consideration, and determination to do something with some resolution, and then transformation again. So notice that the story starts and stops at the same place, kind of at the bottom. It's like gravity. It takes energy to go through this transformational process. So let's take a look at what this looks like at work. Since we're in a story at work, we might have said something like this. We had successful operations at work, but we knew more competition was coming. We discovered a new idea that we could incorporate and created a new vision. Development took some time, but it all came together. Now operations are even better. So we see this word automation, and we tend to use it only to mean mechanical automation. The root term really means mindless work, which humans are actually pretty good at as well, getting into their routine. So I won't dive too deeply into this, but there's some academic peer-reviewed articles and conference around this core model of answering the question, how do you know there's basically 6 phases of change in story structure? And this is showing sort of the idea that it's based on workability beliefs. You've probably heard it either works or it doesn't work. There's a third workability belief, that our mindset is in individually and collectively when we're in a project called could work. And then the way that we're operating, usually we'll notice this was in research that was done looking at all the languages and what's at the end of a question mark and a period and an exclamation point, sort of the mode that we're in. So this is saying basically, when we say automation, what are the states driving that? That's basically means we're in a does work belief reactively. And at the top, at the other end, what does ideation mean? That we're in a mindset of could work while questioning. Okay, so with that, let's take a quick look at a few of the bullets related to each one of these. It's a shortened list for a half hour today. So key automation characteristics: operating on autopilot, status quo, routine of our daily operations. Success measures are proficiency, predictable routines, low amount of variation, and common failures. Firefighting is the norm, workarounds is the norm. Disruption characteristics: preparing and responding to situations that are out of the ordinary. Success measures usually around identifying scope and priorities and prepared solutions for identified risks. And examples of common failures are thinking all disruptions are problems, not seeing them also as opportunities, and waiting for disruptions rather than being the catalyst for them. All right, that moves us up to investigation, asking questions to understand and reveal updated and detailed situation awareness, and success measures, finding underlying root causes and root factors. And common failures would be a lack of objectivity, ungrounded assumptions. With ideation, characteristics are brainstorming, diversity of initial ideas, and then transparency and selection process to close out our chosen design chosen design and a plan to put that into action so that we can enter into the next phase. So success measures are going to be balancing ingenuity and attainability, not biting off too much, articulating risk and rewards of the chosen idea. Common failure is going to be creativity for its own sake, rushing through initial brainstorming. With expectations, it's about setting and fulfilling expectations, acting to execute the design and plan established in ideation. And success measures are clear expectations and development process, development of ideas, capabilities, and people, not just the project, but the people are developing as well. And common failures, a lack of a commitment or even sticking with a bad plan. And it takes us to affirmation, confirming what we thought could work does work. A solution resolves issues identified in disruption. And success measures are achieving desired outcomes, solutions prepped for success in automation. That's a big one. I'll stop for a second on that one. I've seen situations where people move all the way through this cycle and show me something that works. And it works over there in a room. You can go and watch it. If the engineers and programmers are standing around it, it works. But it's not something that can complete the cycle and be the routine for the organization. It's not set up that way yet. Common failures, never finishing, and lessons never captured, learned, or shared. Okay, so we have another question. Where do you tend to get stuck in the story? Somewhere where you tend to stop in investigation. We've all heard analysis paralysis. We kind of get to that point and stay there a while. Ideation, we're still there, so we're dithering, that sort of thing. So you get the idea. There's another poll question for you. Which area of story do you kind of hang out in? And it's okay just to spend a little more time there than maybe you think other people are willing to do, but that's okay for you. That's where you like to spend a little bit more time. Okay. What did we get? Well, nice cross section for this audience with a little bump in the middle for ideation. Some people, it makes sense for this group, always maybe looking at some new ideas. And that's actually a good thing, as we'll see in a few slides. Okay. So we do want to keep this cycle moving. We want to continue learning and innovating, being creative, and some things can stop that cycle from happening. It could be because of the systems that we have in our organization that should be helping us. And this slide is saying, when you're looking at a knowledge management system strategy, we tend to find that people have told us they have a knowledge management system and strategy, and it's all around affirmation. At the point that we go, okay, this is what we're going to call it. This is how we'll do it. This is the answer. There's a lot of KM systems around that. It could be a simple FAQ page or even an intelligent bot, but it's basically bringing up the answer. And so if we just go across the board over to discovery system investigation, we can find that a lot of times people talk about the big data that they're collecting, but not too much about the type of systems that are doing some discovery across them that to help us bring out some patterns that humans probably would not have with that amount of material to help kickstart some ideas. So it could be the systems that we should be looking at in our organization that is the reason that we're getting stuck somewhere and not continually moving through. It could be that the way that we share knowledge in our organization, if you've ever been to a knowledge sharing session, they generally sound like this. Here's some things that I do, and I can show you how I do it. Great, thanks a lot, and it stops there. But imagine going to a knowledge sharing session where you also request this type of information. Here's some risks and issues we have and what we do. Here's some things we're looking into for discovery and analysis. Here's some ideas we're considering and our ideation process. Wouldn't you like to hear that? Here's some things we're developing and our progress. And here's some evidence-based resources. So this is a way to kickstart knowledge sharing in an organization to make sure that we're gathering what we need to complete the whole story structure. And organizations themselves get stuck in the half pipe. If you're familiar with snowboarding or the term half pipe, it's the bottom half of a cycle. And what would be the full cycle of moving through the transformational idea of story versus the half pipe, just spending most of your time in the bottom half, looks something like this. There's a reason why we call it bureaucracy at some point, where we're just doing rote type of work. So the full cycle is for meaningful learning, not rote learning. If you're familiar with the book title, Thinking Fast and Slow, basically just associations versus maybe sleeping on it and thinking through the whole story structure. The full cycle is where we see projects, transformational change, transformational leadership versus the half pipe where we're just basically reacting. We have routines, transactional change, and transactional leadership. The full cycles for innovation and creativity versus execution and compliance. And R&D departments, research and development happens as we're moving through the entire cycle versus an operations department just executing. What's the relationship? We have normally talked about these as two separate things in psychology. Meaningful learning and rote learning, thinking fast, thinking slow. What story thinking shows us, I think, for the first time in psychology is that they're not really two separate systems. One is a subset of the other, and the larger is the structure of story. Problem is we get stuck in the half pipe again, individually and organizationally. It's like gravity. Bureaucracy sets in. We have so many rules, we can't actually move up and out. And what happens is the larger companies that are in this location get overrun by a young, nimble organization that tries new things. So what I wanted to do after looking at story structure is say, let's go out and look at all the entire world's models related to change. There's 30 in the appendix of the book, and I have over 40 now as people continue to ask me, what about this model? So you probably recognize some models here, some that you like or use or even certified in, and we won't have time in this half hour to go through all of these, but just to give you an idea what I mean by comparing these models against story structure, if you put the map of story behind the directions that we're given, do these things in this order, we're not sure why. Let's say you're certified in PMI. You're told to do these things, initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. So if you know that, memorize that for the test and all the things you would do underneath them, then you're certified, but there's still not really an understanding of why it seems to work until you map it and see that it sort of works because they have most of the bases covered in how it maps to sense making as described by story structure. Same thing for people in change management or people who study change from Kubler-Ross, looking at the grief model. So there's quite a bit of alignment on some of the models that are out there. Also, some that are not really directly aligned. Six Sigma runs off of the DMAIC thinking model: define, measure, analyze, improve, control. It was born out of a factory process trying to control. That's the point of the whole thing. If you're creating AA batteries from different companies and different parts of the world, every battery that comes off the end of that factory has to be very closely to spec as far as its size and volts and so forth. And if anything deviates, you want to spend most of your time, if you're certified in Six Sigma, you'll know this, it's all about analyzing statistical root cause analysis, and doesn't really give you much idea about improve. Just come up with an improvement idea so that you can control that. This model has been thrown out of some organizations because it was hampering innovation and they weren't sure why. But we know now when we map it to story, here's a simple innovation model. Be bold, come up with a bold idea, seek the available. So we're asking different questions in investigation, not what went wrong, but what do we have? What's out there? And repurpose it. So you could have said in some parts of the world, you'd say, well, the big bold problem is transportation. What's available? Well, there's cars. Some people have cars and they seem to have a cell phone. So you could have invented Uber with this type of thinking if you were trained on thinking through the story structure this way. And then another sort of indirect alignment is the way we treat education now, which ends up being half-pipe education, halfway through the story, where you're making considerations to a situation and how you want to solve it. You're making trade-offs and then starting at that place saying, here's what we know, here's how we'll do it, here's what it's called, how fast can you build that into your routine. So there is a way through that. I won't go through the details of it, but it's broken out how to actually start learning through story structure. And it looks something like this. So after going through all this, a book reviewer said, Lewis poses the tantalizing proposition that poor results in education, innovation, policymaking are rooted in a breakdown between the rational mind and the fundamental models that govern institutions. And I thought, wow, here's someone who got at what I was looking at and said it better than I did. So I'm going to copy that and write that down because I thought that was a good capture of what I'm finding. So in general, what did I find in the current models as you look across all the models related to change that are out there? Some are basically describing change. Lewin's model says he thinks of change as like an ice cube. That something's frozen, that's the way it is. You have to think about how to unfreeze it and mold it and change it into what you want and then freeze it again. Some models are related to facilitating change. People are now currently drawn to design thinking as an example. And the third type of models that are out there are influencing change, like Cotter's, there's a few others, where the first step is to increase urgency around a particular change that you already have in mind and want to push onto people rather than facilitating. So these are older models and we're starting to move away from them. People are moving towards the facilitating change models that help us all collectively understand from a knowledge base how to move through change. Why is that? This is another book project that I got to work on called Leading with the Future in Mind, Knowledge and Emergent Leadership. The whole concept of leadership is changing. One quote out of there. Another one is, a future world where knowledge shared becomes power clearly breaks away from the bureaucratic model. And we can see that the usage of terms in books over time is moving more towards the idea of knowledge versus just straight authority. And I'll just read one quote out of this book that says, when Darwin first published On the Origin of Species, his conclusion of survival of the fittest became an accepted business mantra, leading to and supporting hard competition. What is lesser known is that later in his life, in The Descent of Man, Darwin had realized his mistake as he summarized, those communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. But it was too late. Darwin's early work had become a meme, taking on a life of its own and steering businesses away from cooperation and goodness. But I do believe we're kind of at a point of steering our way back. So what do we mean by leadership then? Is it just how you can persuade people? Or I like this Leadership Quarterly academic review of 25 years, what we mean by leadership. They concluded that present practices are primitive. And of course, we need certain attributes by leaders. They need vision, courage, patience, composure, accountability, boldness, and the list goes on. The question is, as we start to map these leadership attributes around the cycle of change and story, we see that there's places where an individual leader needs to exhibit them more clearly than other places. So now new leadership profiles are being based on the story framework, and it looks like this. As you find that most of us can talk our way through a story, we tend to come back home somewhere. As this profile shows, this was an actual profile used in an organization. We changed the names of what was happening in the organization, where people tended to want to hang out. And as you can see, Larry Jones was kind of like off on his own there. He liked to study the charts and the spreadsheets, get to the root causes, while the rest had already said, let's move on. We don't have enough time to go through. Let's start building something. Let's start coding something. And later found that, well, what happened to Larry? Well, they said he wasn't a good team fit. So this is how we talk in organizations when we don't understand that we are in a story, and we actually need to have good representation of people that have a skill set and a desire to spend more time in each of these areas than the norm. This actually is a phenomena that we can see across companies and cultures. You may not know that Xerox was the one who invented the first PC with a mouse and a GUI. So they wrote a book about it, Fumbling the Future, thinking that they should have continued the cycle on their own. Their PhDs studying pure research, the problem of having to memorize commands to type in, realizing that people could recognize something easier. So they showed that to Steve Jobs at Apple. He launched the Lisa and Macintosh. And then finally, Microsoft made it the norm when they came out with their version. Interestingly enough, Xerox's mouse had 3 buttons. Of course, Apple has 1, and Microsoft came out with 2. What we're really looking at is pure research, applied research, and operational thinking that some would say are pretty much the cultures of these groups even today. So the idea is that you don't have to do it alone. You don't even have to have all the strengths within your organization to complete the story. So I was asked after studying all of these when the initial work was done about a decade ago, which model should we use? I get it, it's a map, but I still want to know what the directions are. Like, what do you want me to do? What are the best practices as you look across all of the change models? And I needed to do another level of research and came up with this story thinking model. It's based on the best practices across the board, which is called ILETM. It stands for Identify Opportunities, Look into Gap Analyses, Envision Solution, Develop Solution, Evaluate Trueness, Maintain Status Quo. We won't have time to certify anyone today on this. I'll go through the first 3 steps so you get the idea. So why does it say identify opportunities, not just problems? This is a true story. Right front wheel stopped working on the Mars rover Spirit. This would have been a better story if it was happened to Opportunity. NASA could not solve the problem. After going through all the checklists, how do we fix it? Finally said, what's still working? They finally went back to a question they could have asked earlier. And they realized they could drive it backwards. So with the stuck wheel dragging behind, it pushed away a top layer of Martian soil to reveal a new discovery, salt, which meant there was once water on Mars. So appreciative inquiry is something that's a newer idea than the models that we've been using that came out 50 years ago, is a powerful piece of how to move through change. It's actually the marketing models I found. The marketing groups have figured this out, half price today only. They've figured out disruption and how to move people into it in a positive way. So this is also, we won't get through all of these, but just the idea, this has been broken down for you to understand the archetypes of disruption. If you can think of a type of problem, there's a way to turn it around and flip it into an opportunity. So you can start to think of it that way and communicate it that way. There's an entirely different thing that happens. Also what we know about the dopamine in people as they start to move through a change that actually moves them through the cycle instead of getting stuck in the half pipe by thinking this way. So that's an important thing, and why step 1 is identifying opportunities. Step 2 is looking at investigation, and of course looking at the performance gap, not just being the current state as a negative, but what's also the positive. And the desired state, not just benchmarks, it's broken, what should it be doing, what are other people doing, but aspirations. Where would I like to be as the gap? And then the gap analyses of not just root causes, but root factors. Another best practice I found from the NTSB, investigating plane accidents, is that sometimes there's not just a root blame, a root cause, and it's another place where we can get stuck if that's what we're trying to determine. Sometimes they can find that it was a new pilot, it was snowing, the ratio of mixture on the wings they were spraying before they took off. There's a combination of things that probably led to an accident. But we can't say cause because the plane that just took off right before with no problems had the same situation. So sometimes if you're getting stuck here, analysis paralysis, it's because we're probably trying to find a root cause when there's so much complexity. It's better to be identifying the root factors. And then I'm only going to get to this one today, ideation, just to give you an idea of how we can move through change and move people through change using story structure. This is envisioning a solution. And people will say, I'm not creative. I can't come up with ideas. And I show them there's a process or way you can do that if you're just starting off by just taking things that already exist. This is looking at a hardware store. There's a million things in a hardware store, but there's basically components, lumber and bricks. There's links that put them together, nails and concrete. implementation, ways that we put them together, which creates a new composite, which has a capability to become something that's back into the process. So wood becomes walls, becomes houses, which become communities and so forth. Here's an example I give. This person looked at a doorbell and looked at an intercom and looked at a security camera and said, I'm going to take these three components and put them together. And he sold it to Amazon for $1 billion. That's all it took. So the idea of creativity, innovation, and so forth seems really far out there. And I tell people, let's look at that later on. You'll get to the point where you're envisioning brand new ideas and you sleep with a notepad next to your bed and do other things at that point. But there are ways to get started in innovation. So with that, I won't have time to go through all of them with detail. There's a lot of detail in how to move through change using some of these new ideas based on story structure. Bottom line is that at this point of an idea, what we tend to do when we say change management is we focus on rolling it out. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's the plan, and let's start pushing it out and training people, and maybe even identifying any change resistors to the idea that we are pushing out. When in fact, a good change management really looks like this. It's moving through the whole cycle with people. We train them on doing their job. They think it works, what they're doing. So we just have to start asking them questions. Yeah, it works, but at what cost? For how long? What kind of competition do you see coming? And then people that are even doing the job will start to move in disruption and see what we're seeing and help us come up with ideas that maybe we've missed as we're moving through change, instead of us just identifying them as a change resistor. So in summary, we've looked at story thinking from the standpoint of technology, people, and also process. There's a lot more that I can cover under each of these, but this is a quick presentation on story thinking. Quick reminder, story thinking is a operational strategy using story, not just a communication strategy, with a lot of navigation freedom, not just through the standard full cycle navigation of story. And the key takeaways of all of this, you don't have to memorize dozens of models and frameworks. All roads lead to story with subsets and variations. And don't get stopped at step one. Disruption is a problem and an opportunity. In conclusion, I've showed you some of the mappings and comparisons. I'll end with one more. It's called the mapping cycle. The landscape has changed. People are lost. That's our disruption. So what do? The landscape is surveyed. And a lot of designs that we can consider for the maps themselves. We develop them and eventually it works. The directions are being followed. People can look up the directions. And eventually what happens? We codify that knowledge in an automated reactive state. Directions are followed blindly. Just take two lefts and a right. And what happens? Eventually, in the mapping cycle, the landscape will change. At the end of those two lefts and a right is a new man-made lake waiting for your car. And those blindly following directions will be lost. The point of this presentation is this. The business and education landscape has changed. Those memorizing, do these things in this order, steps created 50 years ago, models, even if it's a certification, will be lost. And story is the new map. With that, thank you for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
That
Thank
was
you, John.
that was
Um,
great, John. Very thought-provoking.
Uh, thank you very much. So we've had two dynamic speakers again today, and we've previously had the dynamic speakers in the last two sessions. We have moved through new thinking. We have gone to barriers to change, and now we're looking at shifting consciousness. And for those who've been along with us for the journey, again, the whole point of blind is that it's not visible, and the point of sighted is that we're seeking to make it visible. I hope that you see that the common thread through all of this has been consciousness, and that we need to become aware, which is where we're going from not making it visible to making it visible, which makes us aware of it so that we can move forward. So with that, I'm going to actually open it up for questions, and I will be looking also through the chat to bring up some questions. So if anybody has a question to start out with, please jump in while I begin to peruse through the many things that are in chat.
Well,
No one.
I have a question for John. John, I'm trying to apply your model to the problem I posed of moving to democratic enterprise. And I'm thinking, where are we in that cycle? I think we're at the ideation phase. The Business Roundtable has come up with an idea and it's being adopted in a preliminary way. Does that sound right to you?
It does. In fact, from your presentation, I would say that the early adopters are in expectation that they are seeing it work and they're starting to put it out there so that you follow the standard um, early adopter type of wave where there's going to be a few people who are out in front of innovation and new idea. And I think that those people are already there, already in affirmation, as you say, that some people are already realizing this idea works. In fact, I probably are going to be better off moving this direction. So I think as those stories start to get out, the people who are just in investigation, looking at this new way of thinking, will have reason to move more quickly through, just like any innovation cycle. Or the idea, they get it, they understand it, not just being told, but they have the time to ideate. And then expectation for their business and their industry might take some slight amount of time because adopting that might be a little bit different than the examples that are used early up front.
And I also wonder, I think you probably cycled through your model repeatedly as the practice is improved. I mean, right now they're on ESG, and later on if I'm right, I think they'll come up with more powerful models like the democratic enterprise in full, and they go through the cycle again. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. There's last week I was at CamWorld and gave a half a day workshop, and I still took slides out of that to make it fit in half a day. Today with half an hour, there's just so much that I needed to cut out. But there's ways that we talk about how not only to move through multiple cycles, but how to think through multiple cycles ahead of time. What type of strategy that is in multiple cycle strategy.
I have a question that was on there for Bill. Are any ideas about when the space age might begin?
Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought. Uh, I I think I have a talent for forecasting. That's why I've been doing this for 50 years. I was right about the knowledge age. I think I'm right about the age of consciousness. My sense is that the age of consciousness is going to take a long time. I think it's going to take 20 years or so. I think we'll probably have something like some kind of unified planet with a set of global ethics or something around 2050. I feel about as confident about that as I did about 2020 or 2000 as the beginning of the knowledge age. And that's, I think, the beginning of the space age, because we're going to explore the solar system pretty thoroughly in the next 20 or 30 years. But deep space is totally different. The distances are so enormous. The nearest star system is 4 light years away, Alpha Centauri. If you could travel at 10% the speed of light, which would be very ambitious, it would take you 40 years to get there. So that's just enormous. It's going to require breakthroughs in our understanding of physics. And that's going to require a unified planet to get all those resources together and to make those enormous breakthroughs. So I think a unified planet at the beginning of a space age is about 2050.
Well, that Barbara kind of sums up part of that too. She says space age, when we're done enough damage to the earth that we have no other option but to settle elsewhere. That would be sad.
Yeah.
Ties in with John Vivi's
I
work.
hate that scenario. It's so
Mhm.
defeatist. It just gives up on what we can do here on the planet. This planet could thrive. It just takes we just need a shift in consciousness, basically.
Mhm.
We need a collective shift in consciousness, and we could thrive on this planet. We have to.
Okay, I agree. There's a big mindset change that has to happen, and we have to figure out how to drive that. Um, you
Dr.
know,
Green, I have a question if I could.
sure.
This is for John. John, thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I would like to steal some of your model if possible for my team. You know, I have oversight of inspectors, investigators, and auditors. And you talked about the 5 whats and the 5 whys. And in my world of inspector general, I won't bore you with all the details, but we often look into the 5 whys for non-compliance or not following guidance. One of the examples I use, and I'll just give a simple one as Inspector General, you know, we would look at 5 whys of why, like I said, non-compliance. So the example, you know, I'm going to use is like running through a red light. So you get to the 5 whys of why you ran the stoplight. You know, first you were late for work, and then you woke up late, the alarm didn't come on, didn't sound, and you found out that the battery was dead, and you forgot to check the battery. So we go through all of these processes for the 5 whys to determine why someone is not compliant with, when we conduct an audit, investigation, or inspection. My question to you is, what are the 5 whats? I'm curious about those and could possibly add those into my program and process when we look at the 5 whys. Can you share those, or just a quick example of what the 5 whats would be that you had in your slide?
Yeah, as you saw, we only have half an hour, and I didn't make it all the way through the cycle. There are specific tools for automation, and as they relate to disruption, so that proficiency is built in, and removing distractions or things that can be automated or put in place, things that can be eliminated. But also, you're right. There's a connection with disruption. They both operate off of sort of if-thens. And sometimes we make the disruption bigger than it really is. Like I have to run a red light and risk my life because I might get to work, 2 minutes late, and what will that disruption be? So understanding prioritizations and matrices that are out there, different ways to prioritize and understand disruption and how to prioritize them is a big problem. I think also related to a lot of what Bill talks about, why people are stuck, or the way that they prioritize is completely off. If we're entering a big project, people are familiar with using a prioritization matrix, maybe based on importance or urgency. There's a lot of other ones that I show, and best practice really is to use multiple ones. As I say, play bingo with more than one bingo card. Like have several matrix of prioritization available and operate from that. And then that will put you in a place of being okay with automation and the amount of disruption that you're going to have. There's always going to be some play with that, and not one of the best practices, obviously, is not to under or overestimate what the disruption could be. So that's just my quick answer right now for that.
Thank you. And I think I'm gonna echo what someone said in the chat. Will we get the slides at some point?
Yes, we'll
Yes.
work on. We'll
The
work on
question
that.
is yes.
They might be in PDF form, but yes.
Absolutely.
Well,
Understand. Thank you.
The whole session is recorded, so we'll make that available.
Sure, this should be online. Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Brian Tucker. Brian, what are your thoughts about all this?
Bill, it's wonderful to hear you today, and I'm really encouraged to combine this information with John Lewis's presentation. It gives me a better feeling for a pathway to what you're describing. Someone had commented about that. I think Art Murray commented, this is really an actionable plan to help bring about global consciousness that you're describing and promoting so much, Bill. So I really appreciate hearing this today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to have you here, Brian. Lynn Snyder, what are your thoughts?
Sorry. Yeah, what are my thoughts? Okay. So yeah, so no, it was interesting. I just don't I just don't do the doom and gloom thing. I think there's a lot of negative people in the world, and the doom and gloom is really not my bag. So I prefer to stay out of those kinds of conversations over. But everything else was interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
We have a something. It looks like a statement or a question by two other people. Rudy Garrity says, "Does anyone else see the age of consciousness as a social libertarian worldview, wherein fact and faith, truth and opinion, data and knowledge are in battle? No interest or time for collaboration, learning, or storytelling." Um, that's interesting because I think that crosses over like with what Lynn said as well, that, the doom and gloom is scary, but also that there's a point where we can recover, but we got to see what we have to use. So I'll pass that back over to Bill. And Bill, what do you think about that statement?
Give me a sharper focus on the question. I'm not sure what it is.
Hey, where's Rudy? Rudy, you want to
Rudy,
pull that out for him?
yeah, speaking of, spell it out, Rudy.
He must have stepped away.
Yeah.
We'll wait for him, and then so I'll move on to John,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
Annie, if you wouldn't mind, I just to comment on the gloom and doom.
mhm.
What I find is being stuck in disruption is blustering, and just seeing gloom and doom is part of how we've been programmed in our education system, because we have a half pipe education system designed around evaluation models, not learning models. And as you notice, that questioning is what drives us in investigation and ideation. It starts moving us out of disruption. And the questioning skills, as I say, are not taught in the classroom because it will compete with the answers that we're being provided. And if there's a way to do this. I've done it. You can start to show people how to move through questioning, how to transition from disruption to investigation to ideation and keep moving. So the gloom and doom settles in when you get stuck in disruption and you haven't really been taught a way out of that.
John, I agree with that too, but I also look at with the academic or the education field. What I struggle with, and I see that Harvard is doing quite a few studies on this, is that I think our students are actually taught, they're influenced more so than they are taught to think or learn. So
Yep.
they're not thinking anymore. When you work with a student, the student will immediately ask you if you're writing a paper, well, how many pages? And they know the topic. They immediately ask you, okay, well, what are the sections? Okay, you need to think this through yourself because you're doing the work to extract it. They want to know exactly how they're supposed to do something so that it meets your expectation and not necessarily that it is their applied learning to what they have been provided or taught. So I think that my big thing with the doom and gloom is, again, I think that the entire world is being influenced right now. And this has happened quite a bit where, people will even follow things that are presented to them too many times, knowing that it is wrong. And they will still follow just
Yeah.
because that is what the majority is doing. And they want to be, as you would do in organizational behavior, they want to be in the in group for some reason, not knowing that the in group has actually made the abnormal normal.
Right. And let me just say that not only is I agree 100%, but we have a perfect storm coming with what you just pointed out. In that there's a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution that looks at whether it was steam or it was electricity or PC and computing. These were technologies and inventions that completely changed the way that we work. And the fourth one is looking at this idea that intelligence itself and AI and robotics are completely changing the way that we live at home and use technology, but also the way that we work, and offloading a lot of routine things to technology and robotics. So the education system, as I say, is putting out students perfectly qualified for the second industrial revolution to work on a factory line. So we have technology we're not going to compete well with if all we're doing is trying to remember and memorize and cram for the answer, as what education is doing, is programming our mind around that compliance, or you could think of it as a half pipe or operations department thinking. And we need more people that are able to be full story thinkers, and that's the shift that needs to happen.
Hmm. So with that, I'm gonna jump here to Siwa, which says how to apply the models within an organization with employees who have been here since creation of the company, old dinosaurs. They dislike new ideas and always say never change a winning team. That's at you, John.
Oh, yeah, I think I saw that scroll by. Well, all of us have seen, if we've been in an organization long enough, that happens. That's why I point out the settling of culture into a half pipe culture. And they call it bureaucracy because you end up with more rules that constrict you than ability to move through the full cycle. I've met a few people, quite a few over the years that work at NASA. I actually worked with them years ago and launched GPS satellites was my early job. And so I'm very familiar with the space industry. But a lot of people that say they work at NASA and have worked there, when you interview them and talk to them about their ideation process and ability to make changes, will tell you they weren't allowed to change very much. So even in places that we think are innovative, we make decisions based on risk avoidance rather than trying things new. And that's generally why we see a lot of the research and funding going towards small startups, incubators, entrepreneurs, because they're not restricted to all the bureaucracy at that point. And that's kind of the cycle of things. I don't know if we've seen many examples where an old bureaucracy has been woken up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you, John. I been reading Rudy's comment very carefully. I think I can speak to it now. I think the issue he's facing is how do we reach agreement among different people? That's really tough
He's signing in by phone.
because everybody.
Hello, I can hear you.
Can you hear us, Rudy?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
You want to state your question again, Rudy? I think I'm ready. I'm ready to speak to it.
Yeah, unfortunately I'm resyncing here my page, but basically, it seems to me the age of consciousness that you talk about, if we just look at the world as we look at it right now, it's hard to believe that there is any place where you would have the time and the people to get together and spend time trying to find a way to learn, collaborate, and make decisions when everybody is on their own to have their own truth, do what they want, faith or facts, democratic, totalitarian, libertarianism. Everything goes and you can't control it. Nobody can stop it. And that's not only the United States, that's internationally. How could we live in a situation like that? And I'm not just being negative. I think I feel this happening right now.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's the challenge. I have some ideas for you, and I think that's exactly that's intrinsic to consciousness. Everybody will have their own consciousness, which will be some mixture of facts that they find valid and attractive and various beliefs. And the question is, how do we mediate among different people? I have a piece that I've just published called Talking Across Differences. I think we need a different way to speak to one another, in which we do not insist we're right and get into arguments, which is what happens now. Everybody argues. We have to develop a way in which of conversing in which we the individual states his views as best as he can, and we just listen, and we just observe the different views that people have in a group, and they will all differ, and we just observe all of those different views. That's reality. That's reality. People all having different views, and if we understand all those different views, then we can see reality and we can reach decisions that work out someplace where we can be together. But the way we're acting now is impossible. Constant arguments that just alienate people and pit them against one another, and then they start demonizing one another. I think we need a different way of interacting with one another. talking across differences. Read the article. It's on my site.
Yeah, I would like to, and my point of thinking here for the group, and Art Murray, you probably have a view of it, because the sense is that we have reached a turning point here in the U.S. where we're on the edge. We're on the edge of maybe sliding towards fascism, away from democracy. We're threatening each other. There's total lies and total truths, and nobody can agree what they are, and nobody intends to. And so when that happens, you get down to fisticuffs. You get down to saying, I don't care what you think, this is what I think, and I'm bigger and stronger than you. And as long as I have the money or the power, we're going to do it my way. And we have one more election here. We may see that the situation we have right here is broken. And if you take that to the Ukraine and all around the world, everybody is doing each other the same way. What would be the faith that we could ever get talking to each other without cussing and swearing and yelling at each other? It doesn't feel too good to me. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, we do that in the academic world pretty well. And we've been doing it here in this meeting. We listen to one another carefully. We don't object. We don't argue. I think that's the key. But it's not what's going on in the public sphere. No, you're exactly right.
I'd like to bring up a question now from Monica, and she made a statement earlier, and then I'll do the question. In terms of leadership, I recommend The Big Idea, and she brings back The Wise Leader by Nanaka and Tasuchi. I can't pronounce his last name, but you know what it is, Takeuchi. But she says, who should know in the organization about these model this ideas? Everyone. How is the way to develop the story thinking into the organization?
How is the way to develop it? It's going to be the same way that we've developed other models. So people not that long ago were all spending millions of dollars on Six Sigma, where they realized that most of that money and development was spent on statistical root cause analysis and investigation. They really weren't understanding change, much less how to work together through it. So from that, people now are moving towards things like design thinking or story thinking. So we understand that there's a change process, and I think it's a matter of just going through and studying it, just like you would any other change model that's come along. I do think, though, that this idea from the discussion with Bill here is that the idea of people disagreeing, and especially when you take it out to the larger topics that are difficult. I bring it back down to a real situation in a company with supposedly the same goals. This is a 3M Post-it note. Everyone has seen this. In an organization, 3M, where time was allowed for people to innovate. And yet, even still, when the person that invented this, which would generally replace most of the uses of paper clips, his boss told him, "This is 3M. We make glues that stick, not glues that don't stick." So you have right in this, besides trying to solve the larger problems that just came up here, right in the same organization where they're providing time to innovate, there's disagreements about an idea. It's turned out to be one of their biggest moneymakers. So I would study change models like that. How did it actually get out, and how did you get around and past the person blocking this and calling it a bad idea? And it comes back to workability beliefs. If something generally works, that's what people in society will start to, over time, move towards, because it works. And it can work in routine, not just because they're being told to, or it's the next change thing that we're being pushed into, but we're facilitated through it, and we get the example to try it out and see that it starts to work. And that's how innovation works. You start to find early adopters, and they find that it actually is better. It works. Bill's point in his presentation is not just that we should move away from the way that we describe capitalism. He's giving examples where people are finding that it actually works. It works better to think in a different way. So we have to come back to the idea that if you trust that people will generally move towards a state of what works. And if we can start to ask people what works about your idea, not just what you think, where have you seen it work? Why do you think it will work? Workability beliefs is what drives a story structure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. I want to throw something out on that too. I think asking those questions about how it works and if it works and all of that is good. But I also think that we've gotten away from some of the original outcomes, like value. Does it add value to what we're doing? And if we're not looking back at that and measuring the value and knowing that it's contributing a positive contribution, or if it's contributing negative, so we can discontinue it and change management, we're going to keep down the same path. I know we talk innovation all the time, and I know we look at inventions, which I think we've invented the same thing 15,000 times. But innovation, we move on too quickly before we even determine whether or not what we've already created adds value. And unfortunately, we have faddism where fads are popular. People see things come and they jump on them. I remember with Google Glass, I saw a guy walking downtown DC out of an office building. He had Google Glass on, and these things cost $1,500. And I asked him, "How are you using those?" And he had no logical reason except for they were fun.
That's right.
Okay. So and I've seen them as they would be perfect for someone in the medical field who is, as they're performing surgery, can see what they need to do as they're moving along. That's value added. So mine is still being able to contribute through intangible assets, which is the total outcome of knowledge and then of awareness or consciousness so that we know exactly that we're moving or headed in the right direction. The other thing that I think, and there was three things that I think that came across when even John and I just spoke over in DC about a month ago, and it's so clear. We got to get mindsets in place, we got to get skill sets in place, and we got to get tool sets in place. Because a lot of times we don't know how to integrate those three things, especially like when I said in DC, when you see an article comes out after the fact that they are now banning discriminatory algorithms. How did they get to discriminatory in the first place? And then how do you remove them once they've been institutionalized within an organization?
Mhm.
Yeah, I do want to pick up on the idea of my example of innovation. I think that that's what Bill is talking about as we get from one layer to the next and finally sort of a consciousness layer, is that we start to ask, does it work beyond the question of, does this device work for me as an invention? We start to ask collectively, does it work for society? Is the overall process working for all of us? And that's what I think the raising consciousness is about, is that the question of workability is reaching a level that's higher than a person or a thing or a company.
Mm-hmm. I have from Monica just a statement that she made too. Many models, theories, ideas, especially those from Japan, are not very well applied because they are understood as recipes and not something part of the culture. I think this is a problem. I agree that they are a problem and they are considered to be recipes, whereas they're not. But the thing is, even with recipes, you can tailor them to accommodate the particular situation. And we don't do that. We tend to follow them in theory, which is perfect, as opposed to following them in practice, which is you tailor them to accommodate the current environment.
Yeah. I have a point I want to offer. Something here, a good example of global consciousness, I think, is the world's response to the war in Ukraine. It was amazing, I think, to see how widespread the support for Ukraine was. There were some countries that didn't get involved, like China. But apart from that, it's amazing how broad and deep and strong that support is. It was a shift in worldview, and it illustrates global consciousness very nicely. We need something like that on climate and the other major problems. But that was a really great example of global consciousness, the Ukrainian attitudes towards Ukraine.
Well, you know what? Starting at home, we can look back at 9/11. And do you remember 9/11?
Yeah,
The consciousness of people and how everybody
exactly,
was,
exactly.
yeah, it was amazing. Even, I mean, people that you would never think was walking around with flags on. This was their country. It was
And
just
this,
amazing. Hmm.
and the support was universal.
Hmm.
Everybody. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Any other thoughts out there? I always like to do the round table toward the end. If we're ending with the conversation, we're about 15 minutes out. So I come back in last words, and I'm gonna kick in last words and ask. I'll start with you, Lynn.
Annie, you're a hands-on
Yeah,
manager.
you keep poking me in the chest. So I like this idea. And all the briefings were great, and the conversation's always the best part, I think, at the end, when people can chat and talk between one another. Some of the challenges that I see, the storytelling briefing is great, and I think it's the best way to. Sometimes I think it's the best way to approach people. Of course, it depends on the organization, but the World Bank did the storytelling version to create their whole knowledge management environment. We've tried it in the Defense Department. I will say that the organization's really huge and everybody has their own agenda. There's a lot of protectionism in the government. A lot of people want to protect their territory, and so they don't like to do knowledge management across organizations. But I'm hoping that Bill's idea of coming together one day will help. We're
Okay.
DoD is a $750 billion enterprise. It's about to be 815 billion. And I can tell you, having worked there, where is all that money going? Is the question.
Yeah. Yeah. Big, nice question.
Over.
I agree. Okay. So Brian, you want to join us and give us last words?
Uh, well, it's encouraging again to hear how these ideas are gaining traction. Bill, I've had the opportunity, for example, to hear you present, and I keep being amazed at how many more examples there are in the world that you can give where there are evidence of global consciousness happening. And at the same time, I do appreciate there are a lot of potentials for it to go the other direction, for consciousness to remain confused.
Yeah.
And then, John, I appreciate the story aspect, and I think that will be valuable not only in the democratic enterprise, but in the nonprofit enterprises as well. So many of us can benefit from adopting this mindset, and I look forward to reading more. So I appreciate this forum to pull these ideas together. So I'll just say thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There are people we haven't heard from. I wonder if we could.
I know I'm going round table right now. I'm gonna hit him.
Good.
Dr. Arrington, Glenda, you still there?
I
There you
am
go.
still here. Yes.
Your last
No,
chance to get
I enjoyed both presentations. I look forward to next, I guess, 2 weeks from now.
Mhm.
And like I said earlier, I'm gonna plagiarize, if I can use that word, some of John's information for my team and Bill as well. This was very enlightening, and I think it's something that I can help my team grow in knowledge and in innovation. So
Very
thank
good.
you. Thank you very
Huh.
much.
Barbara.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
but you're
Okay,
missing in
good.
the picture.
Where'd you go?
I don't know what I did.
Uncover
still-
your camera.
No, it's an issue
There
with
you
my.
are.
There you are.
Here,
There
here
you
I
are.
am. That's because I turned on a different screen.
Okay.
No, I thought both presentations were very interesting and providing, opportunities for further deep dives into some of these issues, because I think, a half hour is pretty short for us for some of these concepts.
Yeah.
I personally struggle a lot with storytelling. It's just not the way I think my brain works. And so, I'm just like everybody else. I appreciate a good story, I'm sure. I just have not been able to figure out how to, uh, wrap my head around how do I use stories in my work. And so it's always interesting to get frameworks like this, because at least there's a framework. There's it's pretty concrete what you were presenting, John. So I'm going to take a little bit more time to explore it and continue to struggle with my understanding of storytelling.
Great. Okay, Siwa. You still there?
Hello, Siwa.
You join us on video?
I guess,
Monica?
well, maybe something.
Okay. Well, we'll circle back and come up with the others. Art.
Yeah, and don't forget Steve Hausman. He's been there
Oh, I see
quiet.
him. I'm looking right at him.
Okay, he's up next. All right. All right. Just a quick thought on moving into the age of consciousness. I, of course, am a knowledge age person. I'm still there. I'm an ontologist. And that's still, I think we still have to build a lot and continue to grow the knowledge aspects of things. And here's one simple example. Democracy. We want to talk about, improving democracy. Well, the world is just bombarded with little cherry-picked facts, sound bites, and people are voting based on one or two short sentences with devoid of context, devoid of any knowledge behind it. So in order to move into this age of consciousness, which I do believe we are headed toward, but to move toward that better and maybe even to reach that target of 2030 plus or minus 5 that TechCast has set, we really need to build upon and continue to grow the knowledge management and the knowledge or work in growing knowledge, because that's where you get, for instance, I'll give you an example. People I find have all kinds of opinions about the Paris Accord, right, and climate change. I ask every one of them, have you read it? It's 35 pages. Every time the answer is no. From Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, every time an executive order comes out, the news media give you one or two sentences about how good or how bad that is. And I ask people, have you read it? Go to whitehouse.gov and read the darn thing. I do for an occasion. And I find the executive order text to be totally different from what the media is talking about. I'll give you another one. Again, people have opinions about China. Well, have any of you read Xi Jinping's 2-hour address at their latest Congress, Communist Party Congress, where he was again reinstated for a 4th term? He lays it all out, everything China is about. Very little of that, and I'm still going through it, is reflected in the media. The media will give you just a little half a sentence that they want you to believe and that they want to push out to fit their agenda. So that's my rant would be, let's move toward consciousness, but we've got to begin to broaden our own knowledge and be aware that the world is very complex. And let's not just believe the sound bites the media gives us, because that drives a lot of the fear. That's where a lot of the negativity comes from, because remember, fear sells, blood sells. So don't listen to the media. Like Peter Finch said in the movie Network, turn your televisions off. Go to the sites, go to the Congress website to read legislation, go to the White House website, go to Congress, the People's Republic of China, their website, go to all these websites and read the real thing. It's pages and pages, but you'll get the context that you're missing from the news media. Okay, that's my rant.
Excellent.
I fully agree with
So,
you.
Steve?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Art. I mean, it requires a lot of work to do that. And unfortunately, people don't want to do the work.
Right.
They get intellectually involved in these things. And
like Annie was saying, the students are saying, tell me what to do. How many pages do you want? You tell me what you need. No.
Right, but we're going to let Steve have his last words right now.
I think what's important about both these presentations is it gives you a way of thinking, conceptualizing how to go about it. I mean, I would have never thought about storytelling before John talked about it, but it's an interesting way of conceptualizing how you do something. And I mean, I've been involved with Bill for a few years now, but seeing his presentation every time sort of gives me new things to think about in terms of where we're going in the world and how we're going to get there. And that's really what's important. How are we going to get to where we're eventually going to end up, and making sure it's worthwhile and good for humanity.
I love that ending. Good for humanity. So we'll now venture back to our speakers and get some last words from them. Bill?
Well, I'm delighted with the response here. I mean, all of you seem to accept the basic premises and you take it further. You're exploring the significance for yourself. That's exactly what we need to do. These are just ideas that you have to apply. So I'm very happy with the way this is going. I'm glad you find it useful. Thank you.
And John.
Yeah, this last couple of minutes really talking about the fact that no one wants to spend any time in investigation on their own. They'll accept what the answer is that they get from their trusted source, whatever it is. And if you have a different answer, they think that you just watch a different channel. They can't imagine that you actually spend hours in investigation art. People can't imagine even what that's about because that's not how education has wired our brains. And one of the interesting things that I found in all of my research is we're always looking for that new thing. And I'm finding that a lot of these things we're looking for, we had in the past. So we had in the 1950s organization charts that started at the top with two boxes, ops and R&D. And we're talking about imagining an organization where you can work and it's designed around learning itself. And another example was from Romeo and Juliet. If you remember that play, the language was different back then. When she says, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" You remember that? And wherefore was a question type that now, if you look it up in the dictionary, it tells you it's the same as why. But it really was never used exactly like why. It was the, excuse me, it was the why of why. So why tells us the ideation. Wherefore tells us the investigation. Why of why, where it even came from. And we've even lost language around that, much less the time spent on investigation. Actually questioning what we think and looking into it needs to be part of this. And so that's part of what I found interesting, that we used to have things now that are lost even in our language that allowed us to do that. And we know now that we should probably, I think the book is called Start With Why. So if you want to communicate what you're all about, the suggestion is to start with why. That's the name of the book. Then a book came out after that one called Finding Your Why, which is all about wherefore, like spending time looking into investigation. So we've really lost our language around that, which I refer to as wherefore, because that's what the term is. That's where we find the why of why, and have time in questionings that take us into investigation. And if we had that back, it seems to me, even this last 5 minutes, that's what's really missing. And when you don't have that, what do? You have to rely on what you think you know. You get defensive because you don't know how to move into questioning and relook, and you don't know how to unlearn to start to learn. All of these other patterns through story are lost, and we're stuck somewhere in the half pipe. So that's what I'm hoping happens to education, that we actually learn how to learn. Full story thinking learners will come out of that institution, and that basically that will give us a framework to communicate with the same mental model in the same language.
Okay, so you know what? We're going to tie up now with the last. We're going to actually tie this up now. This is actually our last presentation series, but we're going to be on November 30th. We will have a conversation type of series or meeting, and that's going to be led by John Hubble, who just had his new book released, Conversational Leadership. So he does these conversation types of workshops, and we're going to see if we can introduce again areas or specific topics that are not so visible to us, that we need to become visible to us, so that we can actually start to apply some of what we're talking about. And if we haven't seen, like, again, consciousness is a thread through this, which means that, we have to be more aware of what we're doing. But we also need to recognize that without knowledge, okay, and without the right knowledge, then we will skew not only our perception, but our reality of our awareness. And that can be very dangerous. So I hope to see you all at November 30th. And I hope you come with lots of questions, even outside of the purview of our new thinking, our barriers to change, as well as this one, our shifting consciousness. Because John will be there, and we'll be open to any and all topics and conversations. And we hope that we can continue these series where we can come back with about 6 more topics and gain a lot more traction in getting the word out about the blind-sighted enterprise. Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Thank
Annie.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good
All
job,
right.
Annie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, can
Thank
y'all hang
you.
back for a second? Yeah. Those with the IIKI, hang back for 1 second.
Okay.
I think, see,